I want to take a moment to tell you about a podcast from the Shalom Hartman Institute called Identity Crisis. This podcast is creating better conversations about the essential issues facing Jewish life. It's hosted by Yehuda Kurtzer, president of the Shalom Hartman Institute, who sits down with a wide range of guests, politicians, authors, writers, and more to discuss current events, Jewish values, and the big questions facing Jewish life. This podcast has a genuine curiosity and humility about the critical and complex issues, everything from what it means to be a Jewish leader during this divisive moment to the experience of being a Palestinian in Israel today. You will find Identity Crisis enriching and enlivening. Check it out, Identity/Crisis with Yehuda Kurtzer, wherever you get your podcasts. This day is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. Fiscally responsible, financial geniuses, monetary magicians. These are things people say about drivers who switch their car insurance to Progressive and save hundreds. Visit Progressive.com to see if you could save. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and affiliates. Potential savings will vary. Not available in all states or situations. Hello and welcome to This Day, a history show from Radiotopia. My name is Jody Avergan. This day, May 28th, 1830, another in what I think we can say is a through line in this show and in American history. Let's call it, hey, guess what? They knew it was wrong at the time. So, yes, here we are, May 28th, 1830, President Andrew Jackson signing the Indian Removal Act into law, authorizing the president to grant lands west of the Mississippi in exchange for Indian lands within existing state borders. Tribes would be relocated by force over the next 9 years, culminating in the Cherokee Trail of Tears in 1938 and 1939. We have, of course, talked about this story and Indian removal a bunch on this show from a number of angles, but today we're going to focus not so much on the tragedy of Indian removal, which we have looked back on a lot, but the fact that there was, at the time, serious political and cultural and moral pushback to this effort. Jackson, of course, got his way, but not without a fight. So, here to discuss, as always, Nicole Hammer of Vanderbilt and Kellie Carter-Jackson of Wellesley. Hello there.
Hello, Jody.
Hey there.
Obviously, the big lesson we're going to lead to here is we have to remember that in these moments there was resistance, and even if the final story is they got their way, the resistance really matters and has an impact. But let's paint a little bit of the political picture here. It starts mostly with Georgia, right? And Jackson is trying to cut a deal with Georgia and trying to clear up some space in Georgia. So how does this all come together that we get to this moment where Jackson is signing these treaties and these pacts and forcing Indian removal?
I mean, a lot of this, I think, comes down to the expansion of slavery. Jackson really wants this land and this territory so that he can expand land ownership that slave owners have. Cotton is booming at this time. And even though the Cherokee have ceded a lot of their land, they have about 5 million acres left, they want more. And they want more to be able to continue to produce cotton, to be able to continue to grow these other areas that they have now had for a few decades now because of the Louisiana Purchase. And so when you get this pushback behind these Native American groups, especially the 5 sort of civilized tribes, these tribes were also slaveholders. These tribes were also like, hey, we've sort of played the role. We've Christianized, we've started schools, we have owned slaves, we have done what you have wanted us to do, and you still want more. And Jackson really sees all of these Native Americans as expendable, and in his way of cultivating more wealth for who he sees as the common man.
Yeah. And I think that that's a good addition to put here because, not everyone enslaved people in this period, but there were also these land grants that were given to veterans of the War of 1812. And so they wanted to give the choicest land to those veterans as opposed to indigenous people. And there was also gold discovered in Georgia. We don't think of Georgia as a gold rush state, but this combination. I mean, obviously slavery and the slave economy was the biggest driver, but there were all of these other pressures that Jackson could talk about as not just about the wealthiest people, but about the common man as well, which was Jackson's big theme.
But I am intrigued. First off, I am intrigued by this gold discovery. We should do an episode on that, and maybe that was the sort of straw that broke the camel's back in terms of finally saying we're going to do widespread Indian removal, because, and I don't want to emphasize this, but I think there was a little bit, Kellie, you hinted at it, right before Jackson, a little bit of a kind of stability. And, Native tribes had given up a bunch of land already, but then it feels like, first off, Jackson is super racist. And so he comes into power and has his sort of particular animus and sort of particular beliefs. But then also all these other little things do kind of conspire, like we were discussing, to push things in direction. But it is an interesting sort of like sliding doors moment where maybe were it not for Jackson's election, it wouldn't have played out exactly this way.
I totally believe that because it was like 10 years earlier that Georgian officials were like, we have to get rid of all of these Native peoples. We're calling for the federal government to come in here and remove them by force. And for like 10 years, the federal government was like, we're not going to do that. Yeah. And then Jackson gets elected. And it really is that kind of tipping point moment, to make the contemporary parallel, like the way that immigration is handled in the United States would look fundamentally different were it not for the election of Donald Trump. And I think there's a parallel there, right? It's a salient issue. It's an issue that's in the air, but it takes this kind of almost demagogic leader to come in and engage in this broad use of federal power.
Especially when the courts have ruled in favor of the Native American tribes to say, no, they actually can stay, and wielding executive authority to.
And so we've talked about that, and we've talked about that being one of the sort of key moments in American history where executive has defied the courts, or at least played a real serious game of chicken with the courts. But I do want to focus in on the kind of various forms of resistance to Jackson's intentions here, starting with legislative resistance. So Jackson, unlike other presidents who have big ideas, does try and work this through Congress, right? And he takes this as a piece of legislation. And, I think basically sees himself as staking his entire presidency on the passage of this legislation. But it goes into Congress where there are serious divides, often, around regional interests, as there are today. But I think we know, in this era, obviously the run up to the Civil War, like particular regional pockets and regional interests are the defining feature. And so I guess one question that I'm really struck by here, we can talk about the various factions, but it is often like Georgia wants its way. Is the rest of the country and the rest of the legislation going to, accede to that? But gosh, Kellie, this feels like it's setting the table and setting the pattern for what will then burst out into the open in just a couple decades later in the run-up to the Civil War. But all the same regional fractures, all the sort of cross interests, obviously slavery itself part of it, but it just feels like you read the way that Congress was divided and squabbling and playing against itself, feels like exactly what happened 15 years later.
Oh, yeah, no question. And the North, we should say the North is very much against this removal. I mean, for a lot of different reasons, but I also think they see the writing on the wall. They know that, like, if Native Americans are removed, that slavery will expand, and the North has been adamantly free labor and the production of free labor. And part of that too is because even though the North still does benefit from slavery, a lot of their factories manufacture cotton, textiles, and things of that nature. They know that the more the South controls the economic sort of stronghold of the country, the less influence that they will be able to have politically. And so if the South can get, even more economic value in these states, in these regions producing cotton, they stand a chance to lose. And so those things, it always comes back to money in a lot of ways, but I think that that's very much top of mind for them.
I've got some great news from one of our fellow Radiotopia shows. Ear Hustle, the show about daily life inside prison, is wrapping up an incredible season that took us from the true crime story of a bank robber named Sparkplug to the do's and don'ts of getting your haircut in prison. But Ear Hustle is not resting on their laurels. They are now gearing up for something new and exciting, an all-new 11-city tour. you can join hosts Nigel and Erlon along with special guests and performers. They're kicking off things in Nashville on August 4th. They're hitting Atlanta, Durham, Pittsburgh, Chicago, Cincinnati, 11 different cities, wrapping up in Austin on August 21st. I have seen the Ear Hustle team in action during a live show before. It is a really special, joyous, interactive occasion. And check this out. If you are a This Day fan and you're going to a live show, let us know. Maybe we'll try and connect you with some other fans who are going to be in the house in your city. You can check out all the details at earhustlesq.com/tour. Once again, that's earhustlesq.com/tour. Tariffs, meme coins, Girl Scout cookies. What do these all have in common? Come on, folks. It's all about the money. Economics is everywhere and everything. It's fueling our lives, even where we least expect it. And look, if you listen to This Day, that means I know that you are interested in context and the hidden stories that help explain our world. So I recommend to you that you listen to Planet Money from NPR. The Planet Money is a different kind of world where the complex economy actually makes sense. Human stories instead of abstract theories. It is econ brought down to earth. For me, going all the way back to 2008 and the giant pool of money, where Planet Money first helped me understand the financial crisis, I have relied on this show. It is accessible, it is fun, it's surprising. It's one of those shows that when you listen to it, you kind of think to yourself, why isn't this the only show that I listen to? Another great thing I'll tell you about Planet Money, they are absolute pioneers in the shorter podcast. It's about 30 minutes. You'll learn a lot. You get in, get out, nice and accessible. So it's time to check it out. Tune in to Planet Money every week for entertaining stories and insights about how money shapes our world. These are stories that cannot be found anywhere else. Listen now to Planet Money from NPR. So here's something that happens every year as it gets warmer. I put away my winter clothes, I take a look at my closet, and I think to myself, man, my rotation is pretty worn out. Same polos, same shorts, same lightweight pants as last year. So I have to buy a bunch of items to feel like I'm ready to embrace summer. Now, let me tell you about something that doesn't happen every year. Me getting compliments on the summer clothes that I purchased. But I am here to tell you, listener, that it has been happening ever since I refreshed my wardrobe with some items from Quince. Just last week on a taping of this show, Kellie said, "That's a really nice polo shirt." It is, and it's actually called a cotton silk polo sweater. It's got a nice little white trim, some great texture to the material. I've got these linen pants that are getting some compliments. They cost under $50, by the way. Same with the chore jacket I got. A friend of mine at the bar the other day reached over and did that little, ooh, this is nice thing, and felt the fabric. Listeners, this could be you. Quince's pieces are easy, elevated, and somehow make you feel more put together without even trying. Treat your closet to a little summer glow up with Quince. Go to quince.com/thisday for free shipping on your order and 365-day returns. That's QUINCE.com/thisday for free shipping and 365-day returns. Quince.com/thisday.
And a lot of this organizing and this moral persuasion and argumentation that we associate with abolitionism is taking shape around this issue of Indian removal. And in fact, public sentiment seemed to be on the side of just like, please leave these people where they are. We don't have the right to force them out. We've signed all of these treaties. And you get this really robust public sphere of conversation that I don't think it's talked about very much, but there were pamphlets against removal, the William Penn essays, with the most discussed political pamphlet since Common Sense. So you have that circulating at the time. Alexis de Tocqueville, who is the chronicler of the United States in this antebellum period, talks about the kind of horrors of Indian removal and the way that Americans try to protect themselves by talking about civilizing the Indian and all of these things. But you also have a movement of women who, as we've talked about in this period, are not legible political actors. They don't have the right to vote. They don't have the right to property if they're married. But they are involved in petitioning to try to stop the forcible removal of indigenous tribes. 1,400 women signed petitions. It's the first time that a group of women appeal collectively to the federal government. And it's a remarkable moment of a kind of both political organizing and an expression of citizenship that hasn't yet been recognized by the government.
Yeah.
And even we should say there's a religious component there too, because when you think about the 1830s, the Second Great Awakening, religious revival, people are saying, well, these Native Americans are Christians and they have taken on Christian beliefs, and we ought to respect their autonomy and their agency in that. And if they're not Christians, what if they might become Christians? So shouldn't we also respect that? Like, there's certainly a moral and religious pull to this too.
Yeah, it is just amazing how much this feels like it reflects the contours that we would see in that slavery fight and the run up to the Civil War, just a generation, half a generation later. I mean, Northern legislators worried about the accumulating power in the South. We have the moral conversation. We have women at the charge. We have the religious component. I mean, Kellie, does it feel like, this fight obviously reflected, I think, the same underlying tensions that were going to be there and burst into the open in the run-up to the Civil War? But in a weird way, maybe this was like a practice run, for a lot of the same actors.
Certainly regionally, yes. I think that more and more you are starting to see the North seeing itself as the North and the South seeing itself in the South, and them having two different interests in terms of where they think the country should go, and competing interests in terms of who is going to be in the driver's seat when it comes to where the country goes. And I think the North is terrified with each new state that comes into the country, with each new territory that's made a state. There are fierce debates. Is this going to be a slave state? Is this going to be a free state? How are we going to operate? And that controls not just the economic balance, but the political balance.
Yeah. I gave Tennessee a little bit of a hard time in an episode a few episodes ago for its role in its role in the Civil War. I should point out that Davy Crockett, Tennessee congressman at this point, opposed the Indian Removal Act and declared that his decision would, quote, not make me ashamed in the day of judgment. So there's Davy Crockett of Tennessee taking a real moral stance here around this issue.
And Tennessee, Eastern Tennessee, as we've talked about on this show, was a hotbed of abolitionism in this period. And so it's not surprising that you would have some of this activism there.
Good for Davy Crockett. I don't know if that's in the song. That quote,
we can rework it.
Yeah. Okay, so listeners, I suspect a number of listeners are sitting here and saying, we're 15 minutes in this conversation, and we've been talking about resistance and all these fault lines. We've not talked about Native tribes themselves and the resistance they offered, which was also, I think, potentially in some ways forgotten and a huge part of this story. So Cherokees mount a huge resistance in the court. The Supreme Court, of course, sides with them. That is the moment where Jackson ignores the court, leads to that. But, it's not just like, oh, here's the Indian Removal Act, pack up your stuff and go. Yeah. There's true political, legislative, and, cultural, moral resistance in this moment.
Yeah. For sure.
Yeah, and a resistance that had been building and shapes this entire story, because this whole thing gets kicked off when the Cherokee in particular are just like, we're not negotiating anymore. We've negotiated enough. This is our land. And that is when Georgia appeals to use force and gets the ball rolling here. And of course, it's just the use of the courts is fascinating because it's an appeal to the legal system of the United States by the Cherokee, and you see it all devolve again back into force when the court sides with them. But there's a remarkably flexible and creative sort of system of resistance that Indigenous people are using to try to keep this from happening.
Yeah.
Okay, I want to end a little with this big question of what it means to mount resistance and then not actually kind of win the fight that's in front of you, and maybe even mount resistance knowing that you're not going to win that fight in
That's
front
my
of
whole
you.
life's work, Jody.
Yes, I would say so. And so, Kellie, I want to read you a quote from a historian, Mary Hirschberg, and then let you react and, obviously tie it to this moment or any other moment you think about. But Mary Hirschberg, historian, says, quote, The anti-slavery upsurge in the early 1830s benefited from the deep disappointment of anti-Indian removalists who vowed not to repeat the process when it came to Africans who had arrived in this country. So you can lose a fight and it can set you up for the next one.
That's true.
And the disappointment can be fuel.
Yeah, because I think that in some ways these fights are always ongoing, but that I will say there are victories. I can't say, well, you can draw a straight line from Indian removal to, the 13th Amendment. I don't think you can necessarily do that, but I do think that the disappointment can create a groundswell that leads you to want to have this like never again moment in which people continue to push and push and push and push. And when you think about the 13th Amendment in particular, that was also created by white women, like white women abolitionists who said, we need a 13th Amendment. We need an amendment that abolishes slavery forever. So there probably are some women that were there in the 1830s saying like, no, this is not right. This is not right. I'm signing this petition. And some of those same people who think, carried those sentiments into abolitionism and how we should think about, eradicating these systems. So yeah, it's a challenge though, because it's, one, progress is never inevitable, and two, progress is never permanent. So it's like, how do you maintain the wins that you get?
Right. It's not just an upbeat story, but I do think that there is something, and we talked about this, I think, when we talked about the Women's March back in 2017, which is every little act of political engagement begins to build your political identity, and you begin to see yourself as someone who has agency within the political system. And no, you don't win all the fights, but you begin to see yourself as somebody who engages with important questions and who's a carrier of messages. And hundreds of thousands of people having that experience builds into a political movement that then addresses other injustices as they come up. And I do, and that creates a movement history that then future generations draw from. And again, it's not a rosy picture. Activists get burned out. People get killed in the process. People lose a lot in the process. But there is something important to be drawn from how these kind of acts accrete and build something, even if it doesn't necessarily feel like it at the time.
Yeah. I mean, at that personal level, I think it's like morality is a muscle, and you have to just use it to stay ready. And you never know when the next game is going to be, but you got to keep at it.
The abolitionist movement really gets formalized in this moment. I mean, 1832, William Lloyd Garrison is developing the first New England Anti-Slavery Association. You have the American Anti-Slavery Association. They're all popping up, within a few years of this. So to me, that's not a coincidence.
Yeah, for sure. All right. Well, this was really fascinating. We will leave it there. Nicole Hammer, thanks to you as always.
Thank you, Jody.
And Kellie Carter-Jackson, thanks to you.
My pleasure.
Radiotopia.